Hi, everybody. Good evening, and welcome to a very special Tuesday talk. Hello, everybody. I'm Seema Kumar. I'm the CEO of Cure, and it's a pleasure to actually, do this sort of final Tuesday talk of the season as we wrap up June and celebrate Pride. For today's Tuesday talk, I think we are going to join the fight against HIV with experts, with allies, and also our partners at OUTbio. So we're really pleased to have a panel of speakers here. And as Pride Month winds down, we wanted to address a few interrelated topics that are of importance to the LGBTQ community. And that has to do actually with advocacy for LGBTQ rights, has to do with advocacy for HIV, and to not forget about HIV as that continues to remain a medical need that we all have to pay attention to. And today, by the way, in case for anybody who didn't know, it's National HIV Testing Day, and we're encouraging everybody to get tested because getting tested for HIV is all about self-care, and that's what the theme is for this year. We also want to talk about some issues about pricing and access to HIV treatments, and then the public health problems that we face and we have to address. So we have very special speakers here, and I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves, but I'll just mention their names: Heath Ingram, Dr. Lippy Roy, and Sean Dixon. So Heath, you want to say a few words about yourself?
Sure, Seema. First, thank you for having me here today, and it's such a pleasure to be with Dr. Roy and my longtime colleague and friend, Sean. It's super exciting, and wishing everybody a happy Pride. As Seema said, my name is Heath Ingram. I'm an attorney at a law firm called Goodwin Procter, and I specialize in taking life science companies, whether they're biopharma, gene therapy, med device, through the whole life cycle, through inception. I work with my FDA colleagues on getting through the FDA approval process, and then I really kick in and take them through their commercialization process. So post-FDA approval, focus on things like market access, access to the drug, the treatment, patient assistance program support, things of that nature. In addition to that, I'm very involved in the life sciences community in New York, and had the pleasure to co-found a new nonprofit called OUTbio Greater New York, whose mission is to promote LGBTQ equality in the life sciences and affiliated industries, and also promote LGBTQ health and wellness. And part of our mission is specifically focused on creating access and awareness around HIV treatment, prevention, and of course, we're all focused on eventually curing HIV. So that's a bit about my work with OUTbio, and thrilled to be here.
Well, thank you, Seema and Cure. Greetings, everyone. I'm so thrilled to be here and see this beautiful facility. My name is Lippy Roy. I'm a Torontonian born and bred. Go Leafs, go. I'm an internal medicine physician. I was a former primary care doctor to Boston's homeless population before moving to New York in 2016. And about a year and a half into the job, we discovered that the leading cause of death among Boston's homeless population was drug overdose. Now, this was back in 2013, before we saw daily headlines of heroin and fentanyl as we see it now. So that knowledge completely transformed the way that I provided care. I became board certified in addiction medicine. I did a lot of listening to psychologists and substance use counselors. So it was just a transformative experience. I then moved to New York in 2016, where I became the first chief of addiction medicine for New York City jails, including Rikers Island, and never a dull day in that job, let me tell you, and a lot more stories I can tell about that. But then I got to really help me navigate the city of New York and meet a lot of lawyers and prosecutors and judges, drug policy advocates, and I then worked for an Oasis-run addiction treatment center in Brooklyn. And since the pandemic began, prior to that I was doing a lot of media work, but I became an MSNBC and NBC News medical contributor, talking all things coronavirus and COVID-19 from 2020 until today, so over 350 live appearances. About a year after that, I launched my YouTube health show, because even I was getting tired of talking about COVID, and I wanted to talk about other health conditions. And so my YouTube show is Health, Humor, and Harmony. And I also started working at Housing Works, where I was a medical director for COVID isolation and quarantine sites, and then the MOCJ sites, the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice. And so I do a lot of some direct patient care. I do treating patients at a harm reduction clinic in the Bronx, Housing Works, media. I also write for Forbes, and I'm just a medical nerd. I love talking all things health and medicine all the time. So thank you.
That's great. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Seema. Thank you, Kerr. Thank you, OUTbio, for having me. My name is Sean Dixon. I'm the Senior Vice President of Pharmaceutical Policy and Strategy at AHIP, which is the Trade Association for America's Health Insurers. I just want to clarify that tonight I'm here in my personal capacity, and so my remarks are not attributable to AHIP. One of the things that I've been working in prescription drug policy for a long time. I started representing branded pharmaceutical manufacturers in their compliance with federal government price reporting, then sort of structuring their commercial contracts with insurers and PBMs and pharmacies to be compliant with that. I then went and worked on behalf of state governments, negotiating discounted pricing for HIV treatments, for AIDS drug assistance programs, and sort of working with the Ryan White program from the state policy side. And then I've been in the think tank space for a while now, working on prescription drug policy before moving to AHIP. And so, across that range of experiences, representing branded pharmaceutical manufacturers, trying to understand the impacts of drug pricing on HIV and our ability to cure it, and then sort of thinking holistically about what the cost of prescription drugs are doing to our system. I think we're really set up for a fascinating conversation here tonight, particularly in Pride Month, when there is both so much to celebrate and then also so many attacks on the healthcare of LGBTQI plus people, looking at our trans brothers and sisters and restrictions on their access to care, looking at restrictions on reproductive care and how that affects queer people, and then access to care for queer people, which is often delivered in the same sites as reproductive health care. So one of the things I wanted to just sort of note at the top of the hour today as we think about this is, when we look at the prevalence of HIV in America, it's about 0.5% of the population, about 1.2 million people. But it accounts for 5% of our gross prescription drug spending. Now, that is before rebates, which I know many people will have something to say about, but given that these drugs are less rebated than others, it's actually probably a higher percent of total drug spending. And so what does it mean about the sustainability of financing a system of care for a relatively small amount of the population that's creeping up into one of our highest drug spend categories? What are we really paying for in terms of innovation? How incremental is that innovation versus sort of a transition to a generic strategy? And then, how will we really think about financing truly expensive treatments like cures, and how do we make that affordable and ensure that it's accessible to everyone? So I think a lot to talk about tonight, and really looking forward to this panel discussion.
Yes, thank you. Thank you all for joining us and on this very special day. So Heath, let me start with you. Sure. Tell us a little bit about OUTbio. I mean, why was it formed? How was it formed? And where are we with LGBTQ issues as it relates to the life sciences industry?
Well, it's a great question, Seema. So OUTbio was sort of born, OUTbio Greater New York was sort of born out of the pandemic. It was a close friend of mine, Alex Verdone, who is also in the community, is over at Roivant and now at Immunovant, and we were sort of looking for an opportunity to bring LGBT people together in the life sciences space, to share ideas, cross-pollinate ideas, and sort of learn from one another. And so we connected with some folks in Boston, and we created we created a group in Boston called OUTbio Boston, OUTbio Inc. We have a branch now in San Diego. We have one emerging in San Francisco. We have a group in London and in Dublin. So OUTbio generally is evolving very quickly into sort of an international organization of like-minded folks who I think are just, again, trying to promote LGBTQ equality in the life sciences and affiliated industries. And so some of the things that OUTbio in particular is doing for HIV and for the life sciences is we're trying to promote access to treatments for HIV. We're trying to make folks aware of new clinical trials that are ongoing in the gene therapy space in particular that are designed to cure HIV, which is sort of a new gene therapy. Generally, of course, is a new method of curing disease, and certainly new in the infectious disease space. And so one of the things that we're trying to do, again, is just raise awareness that, yes, prevention is important. Of course, access to treatment is important, but OUTbio is committed to pushing for and securing a cure for HIV. And so raising awareness on clinical trials is a piece of that.
That's fantastic. I mean, that's what we've all aspired to right from the get-go, right? A cure for HIV and, of course, the big holy grail, which is a vaccine for HIV, right? That could take HIV away from.
I should add, OUTbio is a critical piece of this, of course, is also ending the stigma around HIV and having HIV. And so One of OUTbio's missions is to promote the message of what we call U equals U, or undetectable equals untransmissible.
Yep.
And so if you are on your medication, I'll let, of course, Dr. Roy speak to this as a physician, but we want people to know that if you are HIV positive, but you're on your medication, it's impossible to transmit the virus, and you live a long and normal, healthy life as if you were negative.
So Lippy, there is this whole issue of course, the medical part, but then there is the whole stigma and mental health piece, right? So how much of an impact does stigma and also the mental health impact of being stigmatized have an impact on, we just talked about testing today, National Testing Day.
So thank you for asking that really important intersectional question. As an addiction medicine doctor, you might think, well, what's that really have to do with HIV? There's many levels of intersection there, but people who inject drugs, 1 out of 10 carry an HIV diagnosis. And so whenever we talk about the present, I always like to trace it back to history. So let me take you back to 1981, when acquired immune deficiency syndrome was first recognized as a new disease, mostly among young gay men who were succumbing to this unusual opportunistic infection, as well as rare malignancies. A little bit later, we discovered that human immunodeficiency virus, or HIV-1, was later identified as the causative agent for this, what has become truly one of the most devastating infectious diseases in human history. Since HIV was first identified in the early 80s, over 60 million people around the world have been diagnosed with HIV, and over 25 million people have died. Now, we're in a much different position today, but it's very important to recognize what we went through, and truly tremendous grassroots activism, as well as organizations like OUTbio, which are really making a difference. And it's important to remember that, you were asking me, actually Heath mentioned the stigma, and you brought up again, Seema. We need to remember that people with HIV/AIDS experienced profound discrimination, especially people who use drugs and who identified as gay. If any of you are maybe even old enough to remember this or saw clips of this online, there was a television broadcast, a national television broadcast, where televangelist Jerry Falwell went on national television and declared that, quote, God had sent AIDS as retribution for the sins of drug use and for being gay. So, and you might think, oh, well, that was back then, Lippy. Trust me, there are still people who very much believe in these highly stigmatized, racial, homophobic, discriminatory views. So, and at the time, people overreacted. There was mass hysteria. People still felt that they didn't understand how HIV was transmitted. They thought it was airborne, if just touching you, sitting next to you. It was insane. And by this point, scientists already discovered that how it was transmitted, sexual contaminated needles, things like that. Ryan White, who Sean mentioned, who was a student with hemophilia, who acquired HIV from tainted blood products. He was expelled from school just for having the diagnosis. So we have come a long way, and I'm happy to talk about that as the conversation goes in terms of progress that we've made, life-changing progress. But it's important. No, I know. We'll come back to me. But we have come a long way. I'm proud to be part of a small part of that trajectory, but we have a long way to go still.
That's wonderful. We do have to celebrate the progress and, do that. And Sean, speaking of progress, right? When we first came up with heart therapies, right? HIV patients had to take a fistful of pills 3 times a day with a lot of side effects. And today we are at 1 pill once a day, almost, right? And what great progress. But the challenge remains because, even though there is this, ability to actually keep HIV under control and U equals U is important, with 1 pill once a day, there may be people who can't afford that 1 pill once a day treatment. And then the stigma, if you layer that on top of that, prevents people from getting tested or getting access to treatment. So how do you kind of take this problem of inequity and access and affordability? What do you do about that?
It's a really great and complicated question. HIV is one of the areas where, through the fierce advocacy of generations of folks in the LGBT community, we actually have achieved significant success in making prescription drugs affordable, HIV treatments affordable for people who have access to healthcare. And I think that's really important to recognize that there are a number of supports for lower cost sharing, programs that provide free medication to individuals who are lower income. But the barrier to all of this is still access to healthcare writ large. And so that's where we actually see the bulk of new infections in the US. It's among young Black gay men or young men who have sex with men in the American South. And this is an area where we have the sort of syndemics of interacting social pressures, of the social determinants of health, of historical racism, low access to opportunity in terms of employment, unstable housing, sort of connecting with stigma around being queer. And the lack of healthcare through non-expansion of the Medicaid program, underinvestment in the quality of the exchanges in some of those states. And so what this means is that our social safety net that has made HIV care affordable for many people who have access to healthcare is not reaching those who need it. And so even our safety net programs like the Ryan White program, which would provide free treatment to people who become HIV positive, many people are not enrolling in that in time because they're not already seeing a provider and accessing that system of care. We don't have the networks and the state investment to get that treatment to folks. Much less to say about actually preventing that acquisition in the first place, right? And so I think it's really important when we talk about access and affordability, we need to recognize the gains that we have made in the LGBT community about making HIV treatment affordable. Doesn't necessarily mean that's affordable to us as a health system, right? As I talked about, it's our number five, it counts for 5% of drug spending, but we have made it affordable to individuals. The challenge is we haven't made healthcare affordable overall, and so many people are outside of the systems that would prevent them from becoming HIV positive in the first place.
No, that's a great point. And we talked about stigma, and we talked about sort of advocacy being important. We talked about the affordability and access being important, but so are human rights, right? And so protecting people's rights and then having sort of a legal avenue to fight for your rights is also important. Is that why your firm is involved in these issues and promoting these issues?
Yeah, Seema, I'm lucky to work at a firm like Goodwin Procter where it's one of its signature focuses is on the life sciences space and creating a platform for life science companies to collaborate and get access to capital so they can develop. Oftentimes lawyers are looked at, oh, you can form my company, right? You can incorporate us and just through the paperwork, just get our articles of incorporation filed, all that boring stuff. But firms like Goodwin can really be thought partners to companies, and I think that that's the value that we bring. It's also helping them think through what's your FDA approval strategy going to look like. If you get approval, how do you make the medicine accessible? What do you think about your market access strategies? Sean mentioned work on drug price reporting issues and what sort of healthcare coverage will you get, Medicare, Medicaid, and the like. And so I think, Seema, from that angle, I think what Goodwin's doing and in partnering with OUTbio is an effort to sort of promote the life sciences industry generally and leverage legal resources, legal knowledge to help create innovations. Sean had mentioned earlier how the LGBT community and Dr. Roy as well is at the forefront of trying to push cures for HIV or access to treatment in the late 80s. ACT UP was a big movement. It was actually the HIV movement that created the accelerated approval pathway under the FDA,
absolutely,
which has been responsible for a lot of innovations in the life sciences space generally. And that's a regulatory pathway, right? You need to have FDA legal specialists assist you with that, and I'm lucky to be at a place where I can learn from those folks. So I think that's sort of one bucket, right, of where lawyers and law firms can be helpful, and how folks should look at lawyers as thought partners, not just barriers, if you will, not just know people, but also the community in general is under, and I say community, I mean the LGBT community, not just in New York, but across the country, is under threat. Sean mentioned earlier our transgender brothers and sisters. I mean, they are currently being, I think, horribly treated and used as a tremendous source of misinformation to spread fear. But, and at the risk of going too far and saying too much, I will say that there has been some recent case law in Texas where a federal judge decided that it was not necessary, or I should say a violation of the Religious Freedom Act, to require preventative treatment for HIV, HPV, and other STDs because it violated as I said, the Religious Freedom Act, and sort of was an affront to their traditional Christian values where it promoted extramarital sex. I think that this sort of line of thinking is similar to what we saw with mifepristone and the abortion medication recently. And so sort of one of the legal concerns that I've got going forward in the next year and the coming years is the use of this argument and the erosion, if you will, of deference by courts to expert agencies like the FDA, like the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, which our society leans on to make informed decisions on our behalf. So those are sort of two sort of general buckets, right? Law firms can be useful to innovating in the life sciences space, but we're also at the forefront of, I think, trying to protect our institutions that are responsible for keeping us safe.
Yeah.
Heath, was that the Braidwood decision?
Yes.
So I am no legal expert the way Heath is, but my colleague, Dr. Archie Zhao at Housing Works, he's one of the medical directors, knowing I was coming to this event, and he's somebody who's been doing HIV primary care for decades. He said, hey, Lippy, you might want to just bring up the recent Braidwood decision by a federal court judge who denied PrEP, pre-exposure prophylaxis, and all preventive services covered by the ACA. And this, as he was describing, is a direct attack on LGBTQ community and access to healthcare.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so everything, law can be used for good and, can be used, in ways to kind of weaponize, right? So it's the same thing with a lot of different modalities. But, it's just a message that our work is not done yet. And, I'm remembering back to the days when, I was a young intern at NIH. Fauci was the director of NIAID. And there were advocates, HIV positive patients, who chained themselves to the gates of NIH, demanding to be part of experimental clinical trials. And Fauci and Peggy Hamburg, who was on his team at that time, she then became, the FDA commissioner. Before that, she was a public health commissioner here in New York City, went out and invited them in to have a conversation. And that was the beginnings of when patients in clinical trials had a say in the clinical trials protocol, led to the priority review and approval based on phase 2B. We've come a long way, long way since then. And that was when trials and medicines and cures, dare we say, were still in the experimental stage, AZT at that point in time, right? Where are we now? I mean, it's been what, 40 years?
So let me answer. So the short answer is we're in a much better, great place today than we were, say, 40 years ago. And let me illustrate that through a couple of clinical stories. So how many of you guys have watched that movie, Philadelphia? Came out about 20 years ago, Tom Hanks, Oscar-winning performance. I've taken care of many patients who are in various stages of what the Tom Hanks character, who he played an attorney, who sues his employer for terminating him after discovering he was gay and had AIDS. It was one of the really first mainstream Hollywood films to explicitly address HIV, AIDS, and homophobia. Hank's character is slowly dying. He becomes cachectic. In other words, you see his muscle wasting away. He develops multiple infections as well as other AIDS complications, including Kaposi sarcoma. So I illustrate that a Hollywood example to show that there was a time when people were, if you had a diagnosis of HIV/AIDS, that was a death sentence. No question about it. Fast forward to 2018, I was a medical director at an Oasis-run addiction treatment center in Brooklyn. A 28-year-old young guy comes into the clinic with a methamphetamine addiction, and I said, okay, so I'm going over his med list, and you're not on any meds? He's like, oh, no, other than my meth addiction, I'm otherwise healthy, and he looked like a young, healthy guy. At that time, a nurse walks in, because she just got a fax from his PCP with his med list, and it just had this one med, and I'm like, oh you're on Truvada? And he's like, oh, yeah, I forgot. I said, you have HIV? He said, oh, yeah, I totally forgot to mention. It's totally well controlled. So we are at a stage now in our society where people forget that they even even have it. He was probably undetectable, and as Heath mentioned, undetectables are a group of people who've, for over at least a minimum of 6 months, viral load is undetectable. You cannot detect virus, and these are individuals because of viral suppression from medication, and they can no longer transmit it to other people. It is we absolutely need to empower these individuals to continue taking their medication, telling their story, and we as advocates and professionals, legal and medical, need to continue telling that story. But Seema, to answer your question now specifically, we have plenty of antiretroviral medications that are highly effective. Yes, some of them still do have side effects. I mean, a baby aspirin has side effects, but they're a lot more manageable today than they were 15, 20 years ago. We also have PrEP, pre-exposure prophylaxis, as well as PEP, post-exposure prophylaxis. So there's a lot of good treatments that are out there, and they need to be targeted to the virus genotype. So there's a lot more specifics, but I'm extremely proud of where we are, and that this is thanks to science and research and researchers. But you know, the medical field has come a long way. There was a time when the medical field was not on board with the times and with the people. Same can be said about the addiction field, by the way. Highly stigmatized, or people who are stigmatized, and we need to change that.
That's a great, that's very good call to action here. You know, we need to, you know, destigmatize, and stigma is, you know, is really a big barrier to a lot of the progress we are making. So we talked a little bit about PrEP, we talked about, you know, ARVs, we talked about one pill once a day, and then we talked a little bit and addressed about, you know, gene therapy as potentially a cure, right? And cure, I mean, treatment as cure too. But let's look at the financials, right? And that has an implication of pricing and policy and all of that, right? Because what that means is that you have to keep producing these drugs, because, you know, the moment you stop taking it, U equals U goes out the window, right? You have to be on these drugs for life, right? So in terms of the financial models and the pricing strategy and the sustainability of this, you know, how do we do that? We have to have some other options from a scientific standpoint, right? Because it's unsustainable from the pricing model for it. That's one question. And the other question is, if we do get into gene therapy and as a cure, right? Think about the cost implications. How do we enforce access and affordability?
Great set of questions, and I'm so happy you asked.
It's a tall order, Sean.
Yeah. So I think, you know, one of the challenges in this, well, I think first of all we need to talk about the cost of healthcare writ large, right? It is one of the biggest sources of bankruptcy in America, right? And the amount of medical debt that individuals have. Insurance quality is getting lower, not because there's anything changing about the system, but because employers who sponsor healthcare are opting for lower quality health plans, or health plans that shift a greater cost into their employees, simply because they're having it's cutting in to their total compensation packages and their personnel costs. And so that means people are seeing higher deductibles, they're going into debt more, they're avoiding care. And a lot of that is driven by multiple factors, right? A lot of it is driven by the cost of prescription drugs. An even bigger portion of it is driven by, you know, hospital consolidation and greater rates in that market. But writ large, the cost of healthcare is becoming unaffordable, and it's having impacts, you know, society-wide. And so the question is, does what we've termed in many venues HIV exceptionalism still have a role in a society where we're trying to think more and more about getting our healthcare costs under control? For decades now, as Dr. Roy pointed out, right, we've had this progression of really challenging, difficult HIV treatments that have now gotten to the point where they are low side effects, low impact on your renal and other metabolic functions, and so it's really just taking a daily pill. The question is, how much can we continue to pay for incremental improvements in that treatment versus a sort of sea changes in treatment that we saw over the past 2 decades? Right, if we look at the evolution, for those of you who are familiar with these medications, of TDF to TAF, one is a prodrug version of the other. It becomes this molecule in your small intestine. The manufacturer of this product knew about both products in the early 2000s, ran clinical trials on both of them, and then sat on the results of the clinical trials of TAF for 10 years before actually moving forward with the FDA approval so that they could time the life cycle of this new molecule right to when the other one was ending. There's no real clinical benefit to it. There is a possibility of some small improvement in bone mineral density and renal function for a small number of people. But the companies continue to promote it as this sort of sea change. And so that means two things, right? One, it either is a sea change in which it was highly unethical that they failed to publish that clinical trial for a decade when they could have, given an improved medication to people living with HIV 10 years earlier, or it's not a clinical innovation and we shouldn't have to be paying more for it when there's a generic version of this other product available. And so I think these are the questions that were coming forward in the incremental innovation in the pill-based HIV treatment space, right? For people who've been well maintained on medications for a decade and now a generic version of that medication is becoming available, do we say, you know what, you're in good shape, this medication is working for you, you should continue taking it as a generic as opposed to a newer version? So I think that's the question for where we are now. Where we're going with gene therapy is going to be really fascinating because a cure is truly a tremendous change and is going to be—
We aspire to cures.
Yeah, right,
yes?
no, and we all should.
Yeah.
We're going to see a test case for this later this year when we see the approval of the first gene therapy for sickle cell disease. And that's going to have massive cost implications for our system. Our Medicaid programs, where most of the people who have sickle cell disease as children are located, are going to be struggling with what is likely to be a very expensive treatment and a large demand for it, and a demand that should be recognized. And I don't actually have the answer here today, right? But we do know that this is something that employers who pay for health insurance are deeply worried about, particularly mid-size employers, right? Employers in the 50 to 150 employees range. What happens if you have a population where you have one or two people who need a $5 million treatment in 1 year and that just balloons your entire employee compensation package? What does that do to stop-loss premiums? How do we as a society think about affording these? And so these are questions that we're going to be grappling with in the very near future, both for other diseases and very soon for HIV.
Very soon for HIV. And as I mentioned before, we have a live audience on LinkedIn over there. So hello everybody formally. But we have a question from our LinkedIn live audience. So let me bring that up because this is relevant. What policies can be put in place or are in place in workplaces that keep affected employees in place so that they're not discriminated against?
We have a number of those protections. I mean, I'm sure Heath could talk about them in more detail, but it would be a violation of numerous laws to discriminate against an employee based upon their health costs or their health status. The question is whether or not employers can continue to afford expensive care, or do they keep moving into high deductible health plans that actually result in people not adhering to their care because they've chosen a model that shifts more costs onto people. So we certainly have those protections. I'll defer to Heath on that, but that doesn't talk about sustainability.
Yeah.
Yeah, no.
Can you talk a little bit about?
There's not much more to say other than that. I mean, there are built-in protections for employees for those cases. But I think it just shows.
That actually brings up a question. Do people know what protections they are in place? They have?
I doubt it.
No,
Yeah.
no, it's one of those things where you don't know until you have to find out, and you don't want to be in that position. I mean, so much of the healthcare system is so confusing, right? Yeah. I mean, I've been in it 10 years now, and I still find myself confused by the system, and certainly I think when people go to the retail community pharmacy, their CVS, they have no idea why they're paying the price they're paying when they move from employer to employer to employer and things change. But Seema, one thing I just wanted to add on the gene therapy front, if I may, is as Sean said, we're going to have a test case coming up, and I think the FDA we're going to see is going to be approving more and more gene therapies over the coming 5 to 10 years. But a gene therapy is hopefully, knock on wood, a one and done cure, right? And so the issue, I think, part of what we have in terms of paying for a gene therapy, right, is they're super expensive. So can we come up with alternative ways of paying for gene therapies? One of the most common ones we hear kicked around right now is what we call value-based contracting or outcomes-based agreements.
Yep.
But the challenge with implementing those, maybe let's back up and say what that means is basically, if you're a gene therapy manufacturer and you have a gene therapy for sickle cell disease or HIV,
You get paid for results.
You get paid for the results, right? So if it's 100% effective, then you get 100% payment for that. And if that payment's $2.2 million, which is about what the average gene therapy cost is tracking right now, Sean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's about it. And it will vary, then they should get the full $2.2 million. But one of the challenges we have in this confusing, complicated healthcare system, we have a multi-payer system, right? So how do you have one patient who is employed by one employer under Cigna's health insurance program, and then they move to a new employer they might be Blue Cross Blue Shield, but they got their gene therapy under Cigna. So then does that mean Blue Cross Blue Shield then covers the therapy that Cigna initially negotiated through that value-based contract? We're just not sure. I think these are some of the issues that we have left to sort of iron out.
Yeah, one thing that brings up is, the role of government in all of this, right? And, I'd love for all three of you to comment on that. And then I have one more last question. I want to make sure that people in the audience have time for questions. And so maybe, PEPFAR, was a big piece of the whole puzzle, right? I mean, like it was game-changing to some degree. Why was that important, and what kind of things can we be thinking about in terms of the role of government in this? You want to start?
Sure. Well, I will start with talking a little bit about outcomes-based contracts, and we can think about sort of the role of government then, and then sort of equity and access to care at a global level, because I think it's a really important point that you raised. Right, so one of the challenges with thinking about outcomes-based contracts aside from implementation is what you're comparing them against when you're not necessarily just outcomes, but value-based contracts. And so for a disease like sickle cell anemia, where we don't have effective therapies, a multi-million-dollar treatment may avoid significant costs later in life. But for something like HIV, right, where if U equals U, you can be on a daily pill, that pill should be generic in a few years. If that costs $1,000 a year, what costs are we avoiding? And so there are still value, certainly, in taking people off of that medication and having a functional cure. But when we talk about the pricing of that, we have to be looking at what the comparator is. And that's an area where we're going to see innovation in the rest of the world that has formal health technology assessment at the government level, something that's unlikely to be coming in the US anytime soon. Yeah. But we'll see sort of additional experiments, and I think that'll sort of inform our response.
Yeah. Maybe AI can help us come up with the pharmacoeconomic algorithms that will build the case.
ChatGPT can write the protocol.
And ChatGPT can write the protocol.
All done.
Yeah, all done.
We're not needed.
Yeah.
But to your point about a global equity and the role of PEPFAR, right? So I want to go back to the sickle cell anemia portion for a moment. There are more people born in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, with sickle cell anemia every day than there are in the entire US, right? And so the question is, will we ever see a gene therapy effectively, distributed throughout the sub-Saharan African continent? And so there are massive global equity issues there. PEPFAR has been phenomenal in where we are able to get into countries and provide care of making sure that we have affordable solutions. But it's not a model that I think is replicable with these gene therapies. And so that's going to require a lot of additional investment and thinking critically about how we deploy those resources if they do cost more versus lower cost strategies in terms of trying to eradicate the levels of transmission that we're seeing.
I'll also add that from a global health standpoint, PEPFAR really initiated by, when you have the backing of the U.S. federal government for a disease that was previously tremendously stigmatized. And again, I feel like this is a far gone time when that was a Republican administration. They just recognized this is a virus that doesn't give a damn about your political affiliation. Does any of this sound familiar to us? Recent pandemic
that was going to be my last question.
I mean, for God's sakes, just rely on the science and the data and the experts who understand what's going on. So, and just to go back to treatment, so Sean and I were talking about pills. The new frontier actually as well in terms of therapy is a long-acting injectable medication called Cabenuva. It's really designed for individuals with multiple social determinants of health and who are struggling with medication adherence. So it's FDA approved about 2 years ago, and it's really gained traction for communities of color, LGBT, gender dysphoria, and unstable housing. So it's really made a big difference from that standpoint. And also, Seema, you brought up mental health, and I really don't think I addressed that. I just want to make sure that we make it very clear that these are all very related issues. People with HIV are at higher risk for developing mood, anxiety, and cognitive disorders. Depression is one of the leading mental health issues among people with HIV. And in addition, HIV and related infections can affect your brain and your central nervous system, affecting the way you think and feel and behave. So, and in addition, some HIV medications can also have the side effect of affecting how you think. So these are all related. And it should be mentioned that environmental and social situations of just carrying a chronic disease, telling your family about your diagnosis, doctor's appointments, medications, all of these, and of course the stigma and discrimination associated with HIV/AIDS. So mental health, HIV diagnosis, all very much related, and they both need to be addressed.
Absolutely. And, speaking of advocacy and the role of advocacy, right? Because I want to make a quick note about that, and then we'll have one final question, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So the role of advocacy and the importance of educating people and not letting this kind of slide. How important is that, and how does OUTbio make sure that this issue remains front and center, whether it's stigma, whether it's affordability, whether it's the future of treatments, whether it's reminding people that, like the U equals U could actually result in people just kind of like, you become complacent, right?
Forget you have it.
You forget you have it.
Yeah. Look, Steve, I think the answer here is it's relentless advocacy, and it's a constant education. I think, stigma is an ongoing issue for not just HIV, mental health issues and others. I think it is just continual education, putting the message out there, talking about the science, keeping the conversations rooted in science, not in political affiliation, not on non-substantive issues, keeping it focused on people's health and well-being. That, I think, is how you win this fight. And continuing to push, I think, the NIH's message, which is U equals U. I think that is a really powerful tool. And I think those of us who are in the gay community, we have a responsibility and owe it to our forefathers, those who came before us, who died of AIDS, and died for us to have where we are today, which is the ability to forget you even have HIV. We owe it to them to fight this stigma, and I think OUTbio is happy to sort of continue to take that on.
Well, the HIV community is, a community that is sort of a poster child to some degree for advocacy and for really changing the game of how science is done, how regulatory approvals take place, how things are reimbursed, et cetera. So I think, it's great work, but COVID just showed us how we can forget about everything, right? Was that a risk that, COVID sort of took over and we forgot about all other diseases, including HIV? Just a quick answer from all of you.
Well, life as we knew it just stopped, right? I mean, everything shut down. For those of you who were living and working here in New York, quite literally there was a lockdown, and it was driven by public health measures. This was
an important public health measures.
Absolutely.
Required at the very,
And we needed, this was a novel, SARS-CoV-2 was a novel coronavirus. We knew nothing about it as data was coming out every single day, new research data globally. We discovered that this is so not your typical respiratory virus. And I wrote many articles for Forbes about it, and had many on-air appearances discussing the gastrointestinal and neurologic manifestations of SARS-CoV-2. So everything, life as we knew it, shut down, social disruption, concerts, you name it, school, everything was just disrupted. And of course that led to a profound, unprecedented isolation, depression, anxiety, uncertainty, and of course a rise in depression, suicide, as well as substance use. And again, leading back to substance use and HIV, these are all related. I mentioned the statistic about people who inject drugs account for 1 in 10 HIV diagnoses, but the truth is that alcohol, opioid use, and stimulant use, all of this is associated with risky behavior, which can then lead to a rise in HIV diagnoses. So everything shut down, life as we knew it changed, but I think there were many positives that came out of the COVID pandemic, which is really a recognition that without our health, we have nothing, and relying on people who know the fields, know science, and know data and biology, and trusting those sources, questioning as well, but having a good discourse and conversation. So those are some of the lessons I learned.
So I just want to make sure that we take one last question from the LinkedIn Live audience, because I think that then we at least have a chance here to mingle in the room. And that is HIV is a disease that affects all people, families, including children globally. What's being done globally, specifically in Africa and other countries who may not have access to the medicines we do in the US? Anybody want to answer that?
Well, it's been a few
yeah.
years since I've worked in global health.
Yeah.
I used to spend some time, I worked in Eastern Africa and Haiti and China on HIV many years ago. But as we talked about earlier, PEPFAR is really the leading program there. And I think what's fascinating actually for the life sciences community here, or the biotech community here, is that PEPFAR actually included modifications to FDA law to allow for these drugs to be distributed at lower costs, right? So there was a requirement that all drugs that were paid for and distributed under PEPFAR had been approved in the US, but you couldn't actually get your generic approval to sell it at a lower cost under the existing FDA standards. So there's an exception made for these drugs to go through a different type of FDA approval that allowed them to then be sold to PEPFAR at much lower costs and actually allowed us to reach so many people across both sub-Saharan Africa and other parts of the world. And that's actually one of the reasons why when we saw the patents run out on Truvada, we were actually able to have numerous versions of the generic alternative available immediately because it actually already been FDA approved. And so we actually have a fascinatingly different situation for generic evolution in the US market because these drugs are already approved. You don't necessarily have the same issues with exclusivity and delayed entry that you will in other areas. So PEPFAR has actually had some interesting implications for the evolution of generics in the United States as well.
Yeah, and I know, I have seen also innovation in business models, on behalf of the industry, where those kinds of models and partnerships that were done with, public-private partnerships and partnerships with genetics as well as the governments, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, led to new types of access models that made it possible for increased access. Was it completely there? No, but I think that a lot was done, and I think more needs to be done. The only last word I will say is that stigma. We talk about stigma here. Stigma in sub-Saharan Africa is also an issue, and there I think that there is because of that stigma, the ability to sort of the hesitancy to actually declare yourself HIV positive, right? And therefore, so there is a whole host of socio-economic factors that also come into play. So it's a combination of access, it's a combination of social economic factors, it's a combination because the largest growing group or cohort of people, with HIV are teenage girls, adolescent and young girls in South Africa. That is 70% or so more of it. So there's a lot that still needs to be done in terms of education, health literacy, socioeconomic factors, but also access to medicines. And the only thing that ultimately we want to aspire to and not forget is go even beyond cure, and that is to an HIV vaccine.
I mean, I'll just add to that, Seema, that developing countries, particularly those located in sub-Saharan Africa, have experienced the highest rates of morbidity and mortality related to HIV/AIDS. And just like with COVID-19, where we saw the highest mortality, it disproportionately impacted communities of color, Black and brown people, indigenous communities. Similarly, we're seeing the same things in people in sub-Saharan Africa, other parts of the world as well, and it's not for biological reasons. They are not more genetically prone to it, just like Black and brown people weren't more genetically prone to COVID-19. It's structural. It really is. It's structural, it's access, it's cultural. To your point, Seema, very much tied in to, they don't believe in the virus, they don't believe in the treatments for it, and cultural change takes a lot longer, and it requires a lot more of a creative, patient, empathic, and respectful effort. And I'll speak certainly from my medical community. There's a lot of racism within the medical community. We need to really take the time to work with local community health workers, community support workers, people who know the culture and the people far better than we do, and empower them to really reach people. So it starts with education, frankly, listening from us to them, and that's how we're gonna, I think, save lives.
Well, thank you so much, and I want to just, happy Pride Day, and, I think that next year we'll come back here and maybe we'll have more progress to report. So thank you all very much. Thank you to the panelists. Really appreciate Heath, Lippy, Sean for being here today and for just this wonderful conversation, and to you, the audience, for being a great audience. I want to just, I know that on LinkedIn Live, we're still live. Are we going to stay live, or are we going out? We're going to close it for LinkedIn Live, but here in the room, we can take maybe a couple more questions. Thank you all. Thank you for joining us, those of you on LinkedIn Live.